Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. In the dark hours of a spring night in 2008, 19-year-old Brandon Swanson made a phone call to his parents after his car went off the road in rural Minnesota. For 47 minutes, he stayed on the line, trying to guide them to his location. Then suddenly, "Oh shit." Those were his last known words before the line went dead. Brandon Swanson was never seen or heard from again, leaving behind a baffling mystery that would change missing persons investigations in Minnesota forever. Join me as we unravel the perplexing details of Brandon's disappearance and the 47-minute phone call that leads nowhere. On the night of May 13, 2008, in Marshall, Minnesota, what should have been a simple drive home turned into one of the state's most perplexing missing persons cases. Brandon Swanson, a 19-year-old student at Minnesota West Community and Technical College, had just finished celebrating the end of his spring semester with friends. At around midnight, he left a party in Lynd, Minnesota, to make the short drive back to his parents' home in Marshall. Brandon was driving his Chevrolet Lumina sedan on the rural roads he knew well, having grown up in the area. The night was dark but clear, with temperatures hovering around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. What happened next would set in motion a series of events that continue to baffle investigators and haunt Brandon's family to this day. At approximately 12:30 a.m. on May 14th, Brandon's car went off the road and became stuck. Not seriously injured but unable to free his vehicle, he did what many young people would do. He called his parents for help. Annette and Brian Swanson received their son's call, and despite the late hour, they immediately got into their car to help him. What makes this case particularly mysterious is that Brandon remained on the phone with his parents for 47 minutes, trying to guide them to his location. He insisted he was near Lynd, specifically between Lynd and Marshall, and could see the lights of a town nearby. His parents drove to where they thought he was, based on his descriptions, but they couldn't find him. They would flash their headlights, and Brandon would report not seeing them. They would honk their horn, but Brandon couldn't hear it. During the phone conversation, Brandon seemed confused about his exact location. He described walking through fields toward the lights he could see, believing them to be from the town of Lynd. His parents, growing increasingly concerned, continued to drive around the area while maintaining phone contact with their son. At 2:23 a.m., something happened that would forever haunt the Swansons. While still on the phone with his father, Brandon suddenly exclaimed, "Oh shit!" Then the line went dead. That was the last time anyone ever heard from Brandon Swanson. What makes this case particularly compelling is what investigators discovered in the following days. When they finally located Brandon's car, it wasn't where he thought it was at all. His Chevrolet Lumina was found stuck in a ditch along a gravel road near Taunton, Minnesota, roughly 25 miles from where Brandon believed he was. This discovery would dramatically shift the search area and add layers of complexity to the investigation. The initial search began immediately after Brandon's disappearance. Law enforcement, along with hundreds of volunteers, conducted extensive ground searches. They used helicopters with infrared technology, deployed search dogs, and even brought in mounted posses to cover the vast rural terrain. The Yellow Medicine County Sheriff's Office coordinated with multiple agencies to scan thousands of acres of farmland, ditches, and waterways. The area where Brandon's car was found presented its own challenges for searchers. The landscape consisted of agricultural fields, drainage ditches, and the Yellow Medicine River, which was running high due to spring melting. The terrain was difficult to navigate, with steep embankments and dense vegetation in some areas. One of the most puzzling aspects of the case was Brandon's apparent disorientation. He was familiar with the area, having grown up there, yet somehow ended up miles from where he thought he was. Investigators have speculated about various factors that might have contributed to his confusion. The dark rural roads, combined with the late hour and the celebration earlier that evening, could have affected his sense of direction. The search efforts in the days and weeks following Brandon's disappearance were some of the most extensive in Minnesota's history. Law enforcement utilized every available resource, including cadaver dogs, sonar equipment for water searches, and aerial photography. They interviewed dozens of local residents, reviewed cell phone records, and analyzed the final phone calls data for any clues about Brandon's location. The cell phone evidence provided some interesting insights. The signal from Brandon's phone had bounced off towers in the Taunton area, confirming he was indeed in that vicinity when he made his final call. However, the rural nature of the area and the limitations of 2008 cell phone technology meant that pinpointing his exact location wasn't possible. As days turned into weeks, the Swanson family refused to give up hope. They organized additional searches, created missing person posters, and worked tirelessly to keep Brandon's case in the public eye. Their efforts led to the passage of Brandon's Law in Minnesota, which requires law enforcement to conduct preliminary investigations immediately when receiving reports of missing young adults, rather than waiting 24 hours, as was sometimes the practice. The law enforcement investigation revealed that Brandon had been in good spirits the night he disappeared. He had just completed his first year of college and was making plans for his future. There were no signs of depression or any reason to believe he would have intentionally disappeared. His bank accounts remained untouched, and there was no activity on his social media accounts after his disappearance. The search for Brandon Swanson revealed several intriguing elements that investigators had to consider. One of the most significant was the presence of the Yellow Medicine River, which ran through the area where Brandon's car was found. The river, swollen from spring runoff, posed both a potential hazard and a challenging search environment. Multiple dive teams were deployed to search its waters and banks, but no evidence was found to suggest Brandon had entered the river. Law enforcement also conducted detailed analyses of Brandon's final phone call. According to his father, Brandon had been walking confidently and speaking clearly during their conversation. He described walking through fields and mentioned specific landmarks, though his perception of these landmarks proved to be incorrect. The sudden exclamation of "oh shit" before the call ended has been the subject of much speculation. Some investigators theorized he might have stumbled or fallen, while others suggested he could have encountered something unexpected in the darkness. The terrain where Brandon disappeared presented unique challenges for searchers. The area consisted of a patchwork of agricultural fields, drainage ditches, and wooded areas. In 2008, many of these fields were planted with corn, which by May would have been beginning to grow. The drainage ditches, some quite deep and steep-sided, crisscrossed the landscape. These ditches, designed to prevent flooding in the agricultural fields, could be dangerous, especially in the dark. One particular aspect that complicated the search was the weather conditions in the days following Brandon's disappearance. Spring rains had made much of the terrain muddy and difficult to traverse. While this meant that footprints might have been preserved, it also made it challenging for search teams to cover ground effectively. The wet conditions also affected the ability of tracking dogs to pick up and follow scents. Investigators interviewed numerous local residents and farmers who lived in the area. Several reported hearing dogs barking unusually that night, but given the rural setting, this wasn't entirely uncommon. A few residents recalled seeing lights in the fields, which could have been Brandon's phone or flashlight, but these sightings couldn't be definitively connected to his disappearance. The Swanson family worked with various missing persons organizations to maintain public awareness of Brandon's case. They collaborated with organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and Project Jason, which helps families of missing adults. These partnerships helped to spread Brandon's story beyond Minnesota and kept the case in the public eye. One of the most thorough aspects of the investigation involved the analysis of satellite imagery and aerial photographs taken of the area. Investigators hoped that these might reveal disturbed areas or unusual patterns in the fields that could indicate where Brandon had walked. However, the agricultural nature of the landscape, with its regularly disturbed soil and growing crops, made it difficult to identify any anomalies that might have been related to his disappearance. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, BCA, became involved in the case, bringing additional resources and expertise. They conducted detailed reconstructions of the night's events, attempting to understand how Brandon could have become so disoriented. They analyzed weather conditions, lighting, and even the position of the moon and stars on that night to better understand what Brandon might have been able to see. Investigators also looked closely at Brandon's cell phone records from the weeks leading up to his disappearance. They found nothing unusual in his calling or texting patterns. His last communications were entirely consistent with his normal behavior. The final call to his parents lasted 47 minutes, ending at 2:23 a.m., and this was the last activity ever recorded on his phone. The case has drawn attention from various experts in search and rescue operations, missing persons investigations, and even psychologists studying spatial disorientation. One theory that emerged was that Brandon might have experienced what search and rescue experts call geographical disorientation, a phenomenon where even people familiar with an area can become completely lost, especially at night. As months passed, the searches continued, but became more targeted. Law enforcement used data from previous searches, weather patterns, and geographical analysis to identify high-probability areas. They employed sophisticated mapping technology to track which areas had been thoroughly searched and which needed more attention. Despite these efforts, no physical evidence of Brandon's presence was found beyond his abandoned car. The impact of Brandon's disappearance extended beyond his immediate family. His case led to changes in how law enforcement handles missing persons cases in Minnesota. Brandon's Law, officially enacted in 2009, requires law enforcement agencies to take immediate action when young adults go missing, rather than waiting for a 24-hour period. The law recognizes that the first hours after a disappearance are often the most critical for finding the missing person alive. The investigation also highlighted some interesting technological aspects of the case that were unique to that time period. In 2008, cell phone GPS tracking wasn't as sophisticated as it is today. While investigators could determine which tower Brandon's phone had pinged off of, they couldn't get the precise location data that might be available with modern smartphones. This technological limitation has led many to speculate about how different the outcome might have been if Brandon had disappeared just a few years later. The area where Brandon's car was found near Taunton continued to be a focus of investigation. Detailed analysis of the gravel road and surrounding area revealed that his car hadn't been in an accident. It had simply become stuck after sliding into a ditch. This suggested that Brandon was physically capable of walking when he left the vehicle, which aligned with the phone conversation he had with his parents. Law enforcement conducted multiple recreations of possible scenarios, walking the various routes Brandon might have taken that night. They discovered that in the pitch darkness, the lights from distant farms and properties could be misleading, appearing closer than they actually were. This could explain why Brandon thought he was walking toward Lynd when he was actually miles away near Taunton. The Yellow Medicine River became a particular focus of later searches. The river, which winds through the area, was especially treacherous in spring, with steep banks made slippery by rain and erosion. Search teams noted that in some places the banks dropped off suddenly, creating dangerous conditions that would be difficult to detect in the dark. However, extensive searches of the river and its banks, including with sophisticated sonar equipment, revealed no evidence of Brandon entering the water. Investigators also looked closely at the weather conditions in the weeks following Brandon's disappearance. The spring of 2008 saw significant rainfall in the area, which could have affected any physical evidence left behind. The growing crops in the surrounding fields also complicated matters. By the time the full scale of the search area was understood, corn in many of the fields had grown tall enough to conceal potential evidence. The Swanson family worked with forensic experts to analyze Brandon's final words on the phone. The exclamation, "Oh shit," was described by his father as sounding surprised rather than terrified, suggesting Brandon might have stumbled or lost his footing rather than encountering something threatening. Audio experts who reviewed the recording noted that there was no background noise suggesting a struggle or altercation before the call ended. As the investigation continued, law enforcement developed several theories about what might have happened after the phone call ended. One possibility was that Brandon had fallen into one of the area's many drainage ditches, which could have been difficult to spot in the darkness. These ditches, some quite deep and steep-sided, could have been particularly dangerous if Brandon had been disoriented or tired. The search teams also had to consider the possibility that Brandon had sought shelter somewhere after his phone died. The night, while not extremely cold, was cool enough that someone might have tried to find protection from the elements. They searched abandoned buildings, farm structures, and other potential shelter spots in the area, but found no signs of Brandon having been there. One of the more puzzling aspects of the case was the lack of physical evidence. Despite Brandon having walked through agricultural fields, no distinctive footprints were ever found that could be definitively linked to him. Searchers theorized that the combination of spring rains and growing vegetation could have quickly obscured any tracks he left behind. The case attracted attention from various missing persons experts and organizations across the country. Some suggested that Brandon might have experienced a phenomenon known as walking circularly, a documented occurrence where lost individuals, especially in the dark, unknowingly walk in circles while believing they're moving in a straight line. This could explain why he never reached the lights he thought he saw. Law enforcement also investigated every abandoned building, grain bin, and storage structure within a reasonable radius of where Brandon's car was found. They were aware that in rural areas, there are many places where someone could accidentally become trapped. These searches were conducted multiple times as seasons changed, but no evidence was found. The Swanson family continued their own investigation parallel to the official one. They worked with private investigators who brought fresh perspectives to the case. These investigators conducted detailed interviews with residents who might have been awake during the early hours of May 14th, seeking any overlooked details about unusual lights or sounds from that night. One aspect that received particular attention was the possibility that Brandon might have entered one of the many drainage culverts in the area. These concrete or metal pipes, which run under roads and between fields, can be quite large and could potentially have attracted someone seeking shelter. Search teams used specialized cameras to examine these culverts, but again found no evidence of Brandon. The investigation also looked into whether Brandon might have encountered wildlife during his walk. The area was known to have coyotes, and while attacks on humans are rare, the possibility that he might have been startled by an animal encounter was considered. This could potentially explain his final exclamation, though no evidence was found to support this theory. As the investigation moved into its second year, law enforcement began employing new search methodologies. They utilized cadaver dogs specifically trained to detect human remains that may have been exposed to the elements for extended periods. These specialized canine units were brought in from multiple states, each with different training and capabilities, to ensure the most comprehensive coverage possible. The seasonal changes in the landscape provided both challenges and opportunities for investigators. During the winter months, when crops were harvested and vegetation died back, searchers could access areas that had been nearly impenetrable during the growing season. The frozen ground and occasional snow cover also allowed teams to traverse areas that had been too muddy or dangerous during warmer months. Investigators paid particular attention to the patterns of field drainage and water flow in the area. They realized that if Brandon had fallen into a drainage ditch or culvert, spring flooding and subsequent water flow could have moved evidence significant distances. This led to expanded search areas downstream from where his car was found, including systematic checks of debris collection points along waterways. The Swanson family worked with geological survey experts to study historical changes in the landscape. They discovered that some areas near where Brandon disappeared had undergone significant erosion over the years, particularly along the Yellow Medicine River's banks. This raised the possibility that evidence could have been buried or exposed by natural geological processes. One of the more thorough aspects of the continued investigation involved the use of ground-penetrating radar in selected areas. This technology allowed investigators to identify anomalies beneath the soil surface without disturbing the ground. While several promising sites were identified and excavated, none yielded evidence related to Brandon's disappearance. Local farmers became crucial allies in the ongoing search efforts. Many began paying special attention while working their fields, looking for anything unusual that might provide clues. They reported any unusual objects or disturbed areas they encountered during planting and harvesting. This network of vigilant observers effectively turned thousands of acres into a continuous search zone. The case attracted attention from forensic geologists who studied soil compositions and drainage patterns in the area. They developed detailed maps showing how water, and potentially evidence, might have moved through the landscape over time. This information helped guide subsequent searches and provided new areas of focus for investigators. The Swanson family also worked with experts in human behavior and psychology to better understand what might have influenced Brandon's decisions that night. These experts suggested that the combination of darkness, possible fatigue, and the featureless agricultural landscape could have created perfect conditions for spatial disorientation, leading Brandon to make decisions that seemed logical to him at the time, but may have placed him in danger. Law enforcement continued to receive and investigate tips, though their frequency decreased over time. Each new lead was thoroughly vetted, no matter how unlikely it seemed. They maintained a policy of following up on every reported sighting or piece of information, acknowledging that in cases like this, even the smallest detail could prove significant. The case became a teaching tool for law enforcement agencies across the country, highlighting the unique challenges of rural missing persons cases. The investigation demonstrated how traditional search methods needed to be adapted for agricultural settings, where landscape changes seasonally and evidence can be quickly obscured or destroyed by farming activities. Brandon's disappearance also led to changes in how cell phone location data is handled in missing persons cases. While the technology available in 2008 was limited, the case helped establish protocols for how phone data should be gathered and analyzed in similar situations. These protocols have since helped in numerous other missing persons investigations. As years passed, the search for Brandon never truly ended, but it evolved. Periodic searches continued to be conducted, often coinciding with changes in the landscape or after significant weather events that might have exposed new evidence. The case remained open, with investigators regularly reviewing the evidence and exploring new theories as forensic techniques advanced. The Swanson family's advocacy for missing persons continued to make an impact. Beyond Brandon's law, they worked to improve communication, between law enforcement agencies handling rural missing persons cases. Their efforts helped establish better protocols for coordinating searches across county lines and between different jurisdictions. The legacy of Brandon Swanson's disappearance continues to influence missing persons investigations today. His case has become a frequent topic of discussion at law enforcement training seminars, particularly those focusing on rural search and rescue operations. The unique challenges presented by his disappearance, the vast agricultural terrain, the nighttime conditions, and the discrepancy between where Brandon thought he was and his actual location, serve as valuable learning points for investigators. One of the most significant developments in recent years has been the application of new technologies to re-examine the case. Digital mapping experts have used advanced geographical information systems, GIS, to create detailed three-dimensional models of the area as it existed in 2008. These models help investigators better understand the landscape Brandon would have encountered that night, including elevation changes that might not have been apparent in the darkness. The Yellow Medicine County Sheriff's Office maintains an active file on Brandon's case, periodically conducting targeted searches when new information emerges or when conditions are particularly favorable. They've established a protocol for seasonal searches, recognizing that different times of year offer different advantages for detection. Spring searches focus on areas where winter frost heave might have exposed new evidence, while fall searches take advantage of harvested fields and reduced vegetation. The Swanson family has never given up hope of finding answers. They've worked with numerous organizations and experts over the years, including forensic anthropologists who specialize in long-term missing persons cases. These experts have helped develop new search strategies based on case studies of similar disappearances in rural agricultural areas. One particularly interesting aspect of the ongoing investigation has been the use of historical satellite imagery. Researchers have analyzed images from various satellites that passed over the area in the days and weeks following Brandon's disappearance, looking for any unusual patterns or disturbances in the landscape that might have been missed during ground searches. The case has also become an important reference point for studies on spatial disorientation. Researchers have used Brandon's experience to better understand how individuals can become so thoroughly disoriented in rural settings, especially at night. Their findings have helped develop new training protocols for both law enforcement and search and rescue teams. The impact of Brandon's law continues to grow. Since its implementation, numerous young adults have been located more quickly due to the mandatory immediate response requirement. Law enforcement agencies across Minnesota report that the law has helped them intervene in potentially dangerous situations before they became tragic. As technology continues to advance, investigators periodically re-examine the limited electronic evidence from 2008. While the cell phone data from that era can't provide the precise location information available today, new analysis techniques have helped better understand the general area where Brandon's final call originated. The case remains one of Minnesota's most puzzling missing persons investigations. Despite the passage of time, the fundamental questions remain. What caused Brandon to become so disoriented that night? What happened in those final moments before his phone call ended? And perhaps most importantly, where is Brandon Swanson? His disappearance serves as a sobering reminder of how quickly and completely someone can vanish, even in familiar territory. It also stands as a testament to the enduring dedication of law enforcement, search and rescue teams, and a family that refuses to give up their search for answers. Brandon Swanson would be in his 30s today. His case remains open, and investigators continue to follow up on any new leads that emerge. His story has touched countless lives and led to meaningful changes in how missing persons cases are handled. While the mystery of what happened that May night in 2008 remains unsolved, Brandon's legacy lives on through the improvements in search and rescue operations, law enforcement protocols, and the ongoing efforts to bring closure to similar cases across the country.